In the 18th century, Edinburgh was overflowing at the seams. It was one of the most densely populated, overcrowded and unsanitary cities in the whole of Europe. Thousands of people were packed in tenement blocks where disease, filth, poverty and death were a normal part of life. It was only after disaster struck the town when a tenement block came crashing down that it hit home. This city was at breaking point. The solution was not a medicine or a water system, a prison or a workhouse. The solution had a much greater boldness of vision. To the north were fresh, untouched meadows. Here the council envisaged a glorious new city that spoke of order, elegance and beauty of form, one which would lure back the great and the good, one which would be a suitable setting for the Scottish Enlightenment, and one which would put Edinburgh back on the map. Within 80 years, this great urban development was up and running, and the city was transformed from squalor to splendour. It was brought out of the darkness into the light. This is the story of the Edinburgh New Town. You might think I'm walking through the wild countryside of Scotland, and you'd be forgiven for thinking so. But this, in fact, is Holyrood Park, 650 acres of hills, lochs, glens, ridges, basalt cliffs, and a lot of gorse. It's a wild piece of highland landscape in the heart of the city of Edinburgh. With the Palace of Holyrood nestled just below, this was once the Royal Hunting Park. And right in the centre is what Robert Louis Stevenson described as a hill for magnitude, a mountain in virtue of its bold design. It's the highest peak in the city at 251 metres above sea level. Its name, Arthur's Seat. Once you've had a chance to catch your breath, the views from the summit of Edinburgh's great mountain are bountiful in their beauty. Out to the south you've got the Pentland Hills, and to the north we've got the Firth of Forth with the majestic Forth bridges which take you out to Perth and St Andrews. And down below we've got the port of Leith where the Royal Yacht Britannia is now kept, and that stretches out round to the North Sea. A bit like Rome, Edinburgh is sometimes described as being built on 7 hills, much to the dismay of the out-of-shape cyclist. The reason it's so hilly is because what we're really looking at is an ancient volcanic landscape, a landscape which once lay south of the equator, part of a large continent with a warm, wet climate. And where I'm standing was once the crater of a volcano. And when this volcano was erupting, there were immense blocks of lava and volcanic ash, sparking and fizzing and flying out all over the place. And alongside that were great fluid lava flows streaming down there towards the Scottish Parliament. And when these cooled, they formed hard igneous rock outcrops, dotted all over the place, a bit like the raisins popping out of a rustic fruit cake. Delicious. But fire was soon met with ice. In the last 2 million years, the Edinburgh winters became bitterly cold. This land used to be visited by enormous ice sheets, sometimes covering the area with a layer of ice 1 kilometre thick. No amount of gritting will help you there. As these enormous ice sheets came slipping and sliding through the landscape, the volcanic rock outcrops known as crags were polished and exposed, and the softer limestone which surrounded it was pushed up and around these crags and sometimes dragged along to make a tail. And this crag and tail process created a landscape of great hills surrounded by steep drops, perfect if you're planning to build, say, a defensive position, a castle, perhaps. Indeed, these crags, these raisins, have been centres of settlement and defence since the Bronze Age, and it was on one of these crags, which became known as Castle Rock, from which a citadel grew to become a fortified city, perched on a rocky outcrop. Throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Edinburgh thrived to become one of the most important cities in Scotland, But all the while it was tormented by enemies south of the border, for conflict with the English was unrelenting. Edinburgh, being the first stop-off point for any visiting English army, needed to keep its defences in good check. In 1450, King James II stated that as the people of Edinburgh so dread the evil and injury of our enemies of England, they could build a wall with whatever gadgets and gizmos they could find, and this should be done in what matter of ways or degree that be seen most speedful to them. Basically signing off the email with, "Can we get this done ASAP?" This Flodden Wall was built in anticipation of an English invasion, which never came. It was over 1 metre thick and 7 metres tall, encapsulating the people of Edinburgh in an area of 140 acres. There were a few ports and posterns which allowed traffic in and out, but otherwise Edinburgh was pretty much trapped within these confines. As well as the great Castle Rock and the monumental city walls, Edinburgh was surrounded by perilous bodies of water. To the south were marshlands, wild and unkempt. To the north was North Loch, a man-made lake flooded in the 15th century to bolster the city defences. But for 300 years, this foul lake had been used as a dumping ground for raw sewage. By the 18th century, with increased transatlantic commerce and a growing linen industry, enabled by the local port at Leith, the population was growing so quickly that the city was bursting at its seams. 50,000 people were packed in here by the mid-century, trapped by the city walls. And the only way to fit everyone in was to look to the heavens. Edinburgh became a jungle of medieval skyscrapers. The city still revolved around the High Street, now known as the Royal Mile. And just like the bones of a fish, hundreds of wynds, vennels, back streets, side alleys and underground passages shot out of either side. And people really did live like sardines, and I would know, for this is Milnes Court, built in the 1690s, and it's where I lived in the third year of university. And it was pretty tough. Between the whole building, there was only one microwave. It shocked visitors like Daniel Defoe.
In no city in the world do so many people live in so little room as at Edinburgh.
Edinburgh was one of the most densely populated, overcrowded and unsanitary towns in the whole of Europe. The city was filled with tenement blocks. These are blocks of flats which all share a communal stairway. And this meant that the wealthy and poor lived cheek by jowl. But they were prone to fires repeatedly ravaged by disease, and it was notorious for its drunkenness and violent crime. Sir Gilbert Elliot was aghast at the state of his capital city.
Confined by the small compass of the walls and the narrow limits of the royalty, which scarcely extends beyond the walls, the houses stand more crowded than in any other town in Europe, and are built to a height that's almost incredible.
The High Street would have been packed with butchers, fishmongers, dyers, tanners, candle makers, soap makers, weavers and bakers, so it was a pretty smelly place. The tanners and dyers used urine to treat leather and dye cloth, and the candles were made by tallow, that's melted hard animal fat. And on market day, the fishmongers would gut the fish at the stalls, and butchers would cut up animal flesh on their boards and let the blood run onto the road, slushing around horse manure. With no running water or flushing toilets, people emptied their chamber pots into the streets, and all of this was washed down by the rain into the great lake of sewage, North Loch. And Joseph Taylor's nose fared none the better.
In a morning, the scent was so offensive that we were forced to hold our noses if we passed the streets and take care where we trod for fear of an accident disobliging our shoes, and to walk in the middle at night for fear of an accident on our heads.
Whilst Edinburgh held the accolade of being Europe's most pungent town, it was at crisis point. After the Act of Union in 1707, Parliament and many of the prosperous governing classes jumped ship, taking their families and wealth to London. With economic stagnation, overcrowding, disease, poverty and political turmoil, it was the perfect conditions for a full-blown revolution. One night in September 1751, disaster struck the city centre. a 6-storey tenement collapsed without warning. Now, this happened all the time in Edinburgh, but normally only in the poorer areas. What was so shocking about this disaster was it was one of the most prestigious streets in the city, with fatalities from some of Scotland's grandest families. Suddenly it hit home. Edinburgh was desperately, disgustingly, devastatingly overcrowded, and had been for almost a century, and nobody had done anything about it. So by the 1750s, it was truly full to the brim. The city was at breaking point.
There was only one solution. To the north of the city, past the North Loch, were vast swathes of pastoral land. It was time to free the city from the confines of her medieval walls and start expanding out.
The idea of a new town was not a new idea in itself. It was first suggested about 80 years before by the Duke of Albany in York, later King James VII and II.
The Duke's big plan never came to be, for when he left the city to become king in 1685, his plans were thrown into disarray by the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the new joint monarchs, William and Mary. He probably had bigger things to worry about than the Edinburgh New Town.
So for over half a century, as the cesspit of North Loch was heaving and swelling, the plans had lay stagnant. They needed some bright spark with the determination and drive to get the ball rolling.
Luckily, the man who led the city, Lord Provost George Drummond, was a visionary. He had spent his lifetime improving his beloved city of Edinburgh, and finally, by the 1750s, momentum started to build.
It was a decade of booming international trade and a new culture of optimism in Scotland, a belief in economic progress and the Enlightenment values of civic society.
Drummond commissioned a report.
Wealth is only to be obtained by trade and commerce, and these are only carried on to advantage in populous cities. There also we find the chief objects of pleasure and ambition, and there consequently all those will flock whose circumstances can afford it.
The plan was exactly what cities do today. They invest in the infrastructure and culture of the city to reel in skilled workers and private capital. Edinburgh's New Town project was designed to lure back Scottish noblemen who had jumped ship to London, persuading them that the cityscape of wide symmetrical streets, terraced townhouses, luxury shopping and open squares and gardens where they might promenade or show off their new bonnet.
Perhaps Drummond looked to seas for inspiration, for it was during these years that St. Petersburg was erected upon the marshes of the Baltic coast, and Lisbon was rebuilt after the terrible earthquake of 1755.
But whilst these projects were funded by a crown, Scotland hadn't had a royal court since 1603. It was a momentous task for Drummond, who spent 10 years marshalling the finances. He had to sort through custom revenues, duties on ale, public loans and the seized assets of Jacobite rebels. And he banked on future income by selling the residential lots of the development off-plan to private individuals. In 1766, a competition was launched to design the plans for the new town, and by the 6th of June 1767, the minutes of the Edinburgh Town Council proclaimed, "On Wednesday last, the magistrates of Edinburgh conferred on Mr. James Craig, architect, a gold medal with the freedom of the city in a silver box as a reward for his merit for having designed the best plan of the new town."
James Craig was only 21 years old. He was the son of an Edinburgh merchant, and his uncle was a poet who had written the lyrics to Rule Britannia. Winning the New Town competition was his big break, and all eyes in Europe looked in to await how the Scottish capital would be transformed. And in light of the Jacobite rebellion, which had threatened to uproot the British monarchy, Drummond and his team took this as an opportunity to show their loyalty to George III's Hanoverian dynasty. And so the first plan of James Craig, which was published by John Laurie in 1766, reflected the shape of the Union flag, with diagonal streets stretching out from a central square.
Now this never came to be. Perhaps living in a triangular-shaped house wasn't very practical. And in 1767, James Craig produced the rectangular plan, which was the final design.
Craig designed 3 parallel wide roads running east to west, intersected by 3 smaller cross streets running north to south. These were for Edinburgh's grandest houses, and behind them were the minor streets and stable lanes to keep the riffraff out of sight.
Instead of tottering tenements perched on a ridge, the New Town buildings adhered to classical orders. They were solidly constructed and broad rather than tall. There was generous space, open views, light and order.
And unlike the dark granite of the medieval Old Town, the New Town was built of a distinctive light grey stone of the local Craigleith quarry.
The principles of the Scottish Enlightenment of rationality, order, logic, light was cemented in Craig's neoclassical design.
The names of these streets were a great political gesture, for they were all named after George III and his family. The 3 principal streets were George Street, Queen Street and Princes Street, and of those were Frederick Street after his second son and Hanover Street after the Great Dynasty. And to symbolise the union of the 2 nations, the 2 squares were named after patron saints, St George's Square and St Andrew's Square, although this sent the city into a flurry of confusion, for there was already a George Square in Edinburgh. So, in an ode to George III's Queen, it was renamed Charlotte Square. And to really crush the spirit of any remaining Jacobite rebels, the 2 minor streets, Thistle Street and Rose Street, took the names of the national symbols of Scotland and England.
But whilst the PR spouted ideas of enlightenment, order and rationality, behind the scenes was rather more chaotic. First of all, it was jolly hard to persuade people to buy into the new developments. The land was given out by a process called feuing, the most common form of land tenure in Scotland, and developers could buy plots to build on, so long as they stuck to the overall vision. And were people rushing into the councils to bag a spot in this prime real estate? Were there crowds shoving up against the doors, kicking and screaming and pushing to get first dibs?
I'm afraid it was quite the opposite. The take-up was at best sluggish. The first plot of land was taken up by John Young, who was paid a princely sum of £20 to get the ball rolling. And his house, the very first house to be built in this great Enlightenment project of order and rationality, paid absolutely no attention to Craig's plan.
Rather than build a row of terraced townhouses as instructed, Mr. Young decided to build 2 houses facing each other across a small grass court, and this is what remains of Thistle Court as it came to be known. It's widely regarded as the first house of the New Town, up and running by 1767, but it's also been suggested that Mr. Young had already built a property on Thistle Lane, and the courtyard was built to protect his lovely view of the Firth of Forth.
To ensure that no one else followed Mr. Young's approach, some say it was creative, others say anarchic, the City Council laid down the law with building restrictions. Ornamentation was to be kept to a minimum, and the streets were to be fronted by droved ashlar, basically large blocks neatly carved to even faces and square edges, then scored with parallel lines made by a broad chisel. But the New Town residents went out of their way to bend the rules.
Craig had planned for 2 churches to mark each end of George Street, but the land for the church near St Andrew's Square was such a prime location, with views running right down towards Charlotte Square, that it was too enticing an offer for Sir Lawrence Dundas. And so in 1774 he bought the land and bought himself a grand house. The church was bumped off to George Street instead.
Another of the earliest residents was Sir John Sinclair, a politician who lived with his family at 133 George Street. He and most of his 15 children were over 6 feet tall, and the pavement outside his home was known as the Giant's Causeway.
From the end of the 1760s, the professional and business classes gradually deserted the old town tenements in favour of these more desirable family residences, where the domestic servants could be tucked away, living and working in the attics and basements.
And it was in these basements that the hoi polloi did the legwork to ensure that the new residents could enjoy a lifestyle of dinners, routs, evening parties and dances. A maidservant might awake at 6 a.m. or even 4 a.m. on washing days and not finish until 11 o'clock. Sounds like she might have appreciated one of these cappuccinos.
Thank you so much, thank you.
The final part of James Craig's New Town plan to be built was Charlotte Square, and the City Council had really warmed up to it all now. Everyone realised the new town was actually a super idea, and they weren't having to pay people like Mr. Young to move in anymore. So for this final flourish, they really pushed the boat out. They approached the best in the business, the absolute, undoubted creme de la creme. They got in touch with the Scotsman, Robert Adam, a champion of the neoclassical style and one of the greatest architects the country had ever seen.
The new town so far had been designed in terraces where each house was clearly marked out, but Charlotte Square had grander aspirations. Each of the four sides is decorated as one monumental palatial facade with individual houses integrated within. And the lower stories of each block is rusticated, and above that the facades follow a mixture of Ionic and Corinthian orders, but really there's not that much decor apart from that. A few of the sections of friezes carrying the north and south terraces are carved to imitate the honeysuckle flower. And there are also, which is very common Robert Adams style, panels showing garlands of foliage, so-called swags, which can also be found in his interior decorations.
These 100-metre-long facades were not without a few handy features. What do you think of this trumpet shape in the railings, which was used to snuff out the torches carried by link boys who would light your way home at night? And many of the front steps have iron boot scrapers, so your visitors can remove any mud before they walk on any carpets. And this raised pavement with mounting blocks allowed you to easily hop in and out of your carriage.
The first view in Charlotte Square was granted in 1792, shortly after Robert Adams' death. But the outbreak of war with revolutionary France led to a downturn in the building market, and after the completion of the first house, it took a while for things to get going again. And so it was only in 1820, that's 30 years after it was first designed, that the final stone was in position.
This became the most fashionable address in Edinburgh and welcomed many famous residents over the years. We've had Alexander Bell, the inventor of the telephone, and Joseph Lister of Listerine fame, the pioneer of antiseptic medicine. And these streets behind Charlotte Square would have once been bustling with deliveries, carriages and horses. But these days the inhabitants are perhaps a little less industrious.
And this is where I live for my 4th year of university, number 3 Randolph Place. That's my bedroom up there, where I spent my 4th year writing my dissertation on James Gilroy. It was quite a transformation for the city. Just 80 years since the 1751 tenement collapse, it was now home to the largest planned city development in the world.
James Craig's New Town became known as the first New Town, for soon enough 2 further new towns were built, with elegant rows of classical terraces popping up until the mid-19th century.
Charlotte Bronte was most impressed by what she saw. She wrote that London was just prose compared to the poetry of Edinburgh, and London was like a great rumbling, rambling, heavy epic compared to Edinburgh, a lyric, brief, bright, clear, and vital as a flash of lightning. Although built for Edinburgh's wealthy middle classes, the elegant squares and gleaming terraces were much more than residential ornaments. The new town provided both the setting and the inspiration for the Scottish Enlightenment, and it was during these decades that Edinburgh became Europe's leading philosophical inquiry centre for scientific experiment and debate, and it coined the nickname the Athens of the North.
Even the great philosopher Voltaire admitted,
"Today it is from Scotland that we get the rules of taste in all the art, from epic poetry to gardening."
Like the students who live in these flats today, dinner parties were all the rage for the great philosophers. David Hume moved in as soon as he could, hosting parties with the intellectual creme de la creme. His table plans included the economist Adam Smith, the chemist Joseph Black, the historian William Robertson, and the political philosopher Adam Ferguson, all putting the world to rights over boiled puddings.
Soon enough, social clubs sprang up and institutions were founded to promote learning and debate. There was the Assembly Rooms, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Royal Scottish Academy.
Whilst they weren't preoccupied with all this Enlightenment thinking outside the box, one of the biggest challenges Newtown residents faced was the wind. Here's what Edward Topham had to say when he visited in the 1770s.
As Edinburgh is situated on the borders of the sea and surrounded by hills of an immense height, Currents of air are carried down between them with a rapidity and violence which nothing can resist. The New Bridge is the chief scene where these winds exert their influence, and you receive it with the same force you would were it conveyed to you through a pair of bellows. In walking over it this morning, I had the pleasure of adjusting a lady's petticoats, which had blown almost entirely over her head, and which prevented her disengaging herself from the situation she was in. But one poor gentleman, who was rather too much engaged with the novelty of the objects before him, unfortunately forgot his own hat and wig, which were listed up by an unpremeditated puff and carried entirely away.
And the back streets have just as much a story to tell. In 1803, number 28 Thistle Street saw the UK premiere of the waxworks of a certain Madame Tussaud. She'd popped up to Scotland with her young son, taking advantage of the short-lived peace between Britain and France in the Napoleonic Wars.
Her grand European cabinet of figures included life-size models of the French royal family, only recently executed, and an Egyptian mummy said to be 3,299 years old, and people really did flock to see it.
For Madame Tussaud later wrote about the trip.
The Edinburgh show gives a great deal of pleasure, and everyone is amazed.
And in 1860, on number 129 Rose Street, a farmer named William McVitie opened a certain McVitie's provision shop with the aid of his son Robert, who had trained as a baker.
The store went from strength to strength, opening a biscuit factory in Robinson Avenue in 1888. And it was a few years later, from these humble beginnings in Rose Street, that the digestive biscuit was born. Tea drinkers will say this is Edinburgh's finest achievement.
The final part of the New Town project was to finish off draining the North Loch to make way for the Princes Street Gardens.
Digging up the foundations of the New Town produces masses of excess earth, and from 1781 this was brought in cartloads to the drained section of North Loch. By 1830, 1.5 million cartloads had been dumped here, forming this great slope known as the Mound. It's since been re-landscaped to form the beautiful Princes Street Gardens, and in 1846 there were tunnels driven through this great heap of earth to extend the Edinburgh and Glasgow Railway into the magnificence of Waverley Station.
But the vision didn't end there, for Edinburgh, with her Enlightenment thinkers and rows of classical architecture, became known as the Athens of the North. And if Athens had a Parthenon, well, Edinburgh jolly well needed one too. At the end of Princes Street is Carlton Hill, and this was the chosen spot for Scotland's mighty ode to the glories of the ancient world.
Construction started in 1826, and it was a terrific idea. There were going to be rows of great elegant columns putting Edinburgh on the map as the new Athens, the Scottish Enlightenment carrying on the work of the ancient Greek philosophers, in a glorious setting looking out over Arthur's Seat, the Firth of Forth and the Castle behind. It had it all. It was Edinburgh's great Parthenon.
Except things didn't quite go as planned. By 1829, with just one row of columns built, the money had dried up and progress had come to a grinding halt.
Now, people have said all sorts of unkind things about this. They've called it Scotland's folly, Edinburgh's disgrace, and even the pride and poverty of Scotland. Well, I think it has a certain nobility to it in its own right. At least it has character.
If you're someone who prefers monuments which have been completed, the National Monument shares Carlton Hill with the Nelson Monument, shaped like an upturned telescope.
It was completed in 1816 to commemorate the death of Admiral Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805. And in 1852, a time ball was added to the top to enable ships moored in the Firth of Forth to set their timepieces accurately. And this circular temple of 9 fluted Corinthian columns around an elevated urn was an ode to Dugald Stewart, a great Scottish philosopher and esteemed professor at the University of Edinburgh.
But the New Town project wasn't without tragedy. James Craig dissolved into obscurity after winning the competition, and he died of consumption in 1795, buried in an unmarked plot, the last of his family line. His personal finances were so sketchy that his books, drawings, and equipment were sold off to pay creditors, meaning none of his original sketches for the new town survive. It was only in the 1930s that the Saltire Society gave him the dignity of a gravestone. And the stonemasons who actually built the new town had a sorry end too. It turned out that the stone dust from the high quartz sandstone of Craigleith Quarry was one of the most dangerous to work with. In some cases, within around 25 years after the work, over 90% of the masons were dead as a result of silicosis. And yet it was their skills, their workmanship, which not only enabled the plans of Drummond, Craig and Adam to materialise, but still stand strong over 2 centuries later. The result was a kind of double city, a city of 2 parts. First, the ancient and picturesque hill-built one, predominantly lived in by the poor. And second, the elegant and modern one, of regularity and order, lived in almost exclusively by the wealthier members of society. Indeed, Robert Louis Stevenson was so inspired by this kind of double existence, he was said to have written the famous tale of Jekyll and Hyde. He described his city as
half a capital and half a country town, the whole city leads a double existence. It has long trances of the one and flashes of the other. Like the King of the Black Isles, it is half alive and half a monumental marble.
In the 1750s, the city of Edinburgh was at the brink of catastrophe. It was this extraordinary vision and determination of Drummond which enabled the plans of James Craig to materialise, and this gave the city a renaissance that it so desperately needed. It saved the medieval old town from ruin and created this gem of Georgian magnificence. And now the city is a working and living capital, which every August is packed to the brim with actors, a cappella groups, comedians and every sort of thesp, myself included, for the Edinburgh festivals. Perhaps I'm biased, but I wouldn't be the first to say that Edinburgh is the most wonderful city in the world. As Walter Scott put it, Edinburgh is mine own romantic town.